So there's a bit of a validation for a left wing, and a bit of a validation for a right wing, and even more validation for the idea that you need to communicate across those different political viewpoints. And one of the things you might also be interested to know is that those political viewpoints are not entirely, but in large part influenced by biological factors. So this is a cool thing, and it's only been figured out in about the last 15 years. So once we got a decent personality model, the same models, by the way, that have been used to show that there are gender differences in personality and that they maximize as societies become more egalitarian, same line of research, we found that conservatives tend to be high in a trait called conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is the second best predictor of socioeconomic success after intelligence. It's an important predictor, and it's a predictor of marital stability and life satisfaction. And like, it's good to be conscientious. Makes you a little square. That's a good way of thinking about it. But as a long-term strategy, it's a good one. Orderliness and industriousness. And the conservatives are particularly high in orderliness. And that seems to be that proclivity to keep things where they're supposed to be, right? And conservatives, orderly types, it isn't that they're afraid of disorder exactly. That was a theory that was very current among psychologists for a long period of time. But it turned out that conservatives are actually less neurotic than liberals. They're lower in negative emotion. And so the whole fear thing didn't pan out very well. But what seems to maybe be the case is that conservative types who are orderly are sensitive to disgust, and so that when category boundaries are violated, the emotion that they experience is disgust, kind of a judgmental disgust. And so I found that extremely interesting when I was reading biography of Hitler. I read this book called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book. It was a collection of his spontaneous speeches, diatribes, let's say, at meal times in the evening from I think 1939 to 1942, and they were just recorded by secretaries, and so you just got a sense of what Hitler thought about everything. And he was a very strange person because he was very high in trait openness, which actually is a liberal trait. He's a very creative person, surprisingly enough, but he was also extremely orderly, and so a devotee of willpower. Right? So he's very proud of his ability, for example, to stand in the back of a car going through the hordes of people that were worshiping him, and to stand like this for like 8 hours at a time. He saw that as a signal application of will. And he was also obsessed with hygiene. Right? He bathed 4 times a day, for example. And a lot of, I learned this as I took apart what happened as Hitler, what would you say, accelerated his purification strategies. So one of the things the Germans did right off the bat was to institute public health programs. And so they produced these vans that would go around and do TB screening. So they're trying to get rid of tuberculosis. Seems like a good thing. Pathogen concern, driven by disgust. And then the next thing they did was decide, well, we might as well clean up the damn factories. Too many rats, too many mice, not enough flowers, too much dirt. And so they had the Germans fumigate the factories to get rid of the vermin. They used Zyklon. Zyklon, I think A, there were 2 variants. One Zyklon was used in the death camps, and the other was used as a general insecticide, pesticide. And so that's where that started. And so they started to clean up the factories, which seemed like an okay thing. But then they decided they were also going to clean up the mental institutions. And that was starting to push the envelope, let's say, a little bit too far, right? And then that just went completely out of hand. And if you read what Hitler said, it's absolutely fascinating, because he regarded the Aryan race as a body. That was his central metaphor, a body that was under assault by pathogens. And so that's why he was always talking about purity of blood. And so his desire to eradicate wasn't driven by fear, it was driven by disgust. And it was a consequence of excess orderliness. So, and you can tell that too. I mean, if you look at how the Nazis arrayed themselves in their political displays, at Nuremberg, for example, which was this massive display area, huge grounds where all the Nazis would gather in perfect squares, right? Absolutely perfect. Thousands of people lined up in absolute precision. And then when they goose-stepped and marched, everyone was exactly the same. It was orderliness gone mad, you know, and orderliness is actually one of the sine qua non of an industrialized society. And that's one of the things that makes that so terrifying, because it also means that part of what drove the Germans, for example, to their high levels of engineering excellence, for which they were absolutely renowned, not only in World War II, but certainly even now, was that orderliness, that unbelievable orderliness. And the thing is, it can get seriously out of hand. And so that's a fascinating thing to know. It was one of the most shocking things I ever stumbled across as a social scientist. And I really found it quite alarming, because there's a reason to be orderly and disgust sensitive. And the reason to be disgust sensitive is because you want to protect yourself from foreign pathogens. You have to, because you'll die, you know. And it's certainly the case that many times in human history, where cultures came together that had been separated, the results were absolutely catastrophic. That happened to Europe with the bubonic plague, for example. It happened to the North American Indians when the Europeans showed up, right? Rife with syphilis and all sorts of other diseases, mumps and measles and smallpox, right? 95% of the Native Americans died. So many of them died that by the time the Pilgrims came to the East Coast, the Indians were desperate to have new people because they couldn't even get their crops off. So that was all very frightening, because it showed that what happened in the case of Germany was, at least in part, the elaboration of an instinct that was designed, in fact, to protect people from actual pathogenic exposure. It just gone too far. And of course, everything can go too far. Conservatives are higher in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're lower in trait openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And if you're an open person, you tend to like aesthetics, you tend to like philosophy, you tend to like movies, you tend to like literature, you tend to like art, you have a sense of it, you know, and you also are interested in ideas for their own sake. And that also makes you someone who, you know, if someone throws you an idea, 6 or 7 ideas will make themselves manifest in your imagination. So the boundaries between ideas are more permeable for creative people. And so to be conservative, you have to be relatively non-creative, and you have to be orderly. And to be liberal, especially on the left, as you move towards the left, then orderliness goes down and openness goes up. Because all you see then is the utility of moving laterally across borders, something like that. And now what's so interesting about that is that both of those are extremely useful sets of traits, because sometimes you should just do things exactly the same way that everyone has always done them for time immemorial. It's a hell of a fine strategy. If it's already worked, keep doing it. But sometimes that's fatal. And so then you need a creative person who's willing to transgress against the boundaries and generate something new, so that you can get out of your now counterproductive box. And so it's the same thing with regards to the political dialogue that I described earlier, except now it's a dialogue between biological types. Should we stay the same, or should we change? We don't know, so we better talk about it. And that's why, again, free speech is so absolutely necessary, because that's the mechanism by which people who truly differ, can come to some reasonable consensus and keep the whole ship of state relatively on course.